The smell hit her first. Even before Dr. Margaret Brennan saw the wound, even before she registered the fevered trembling of the young man on the stretcher, the stench of rotting flesh filled her nostrils and throat. It was a smell she'd encountered before in her medical training, but never like this. Never this overwhelming. Never carrying with it the weight of a choice that would test everything she believed about healing, about duty, about what it meant to be human in the midst of humanity's darkest hour. She stood frozen for just a moment in that makeshift hospital ward at Camp Carson, Colorado, her white coat crisp against the rough military surroundings, her hands already moving toward the sink to scrub. The prisoner on the stretcher was maybe 22 years old, his skin gray-pale beneath the stubble and grime, his Wehrmacht uniform cut away to reveal a wound that had been festering for weeks. Gangrenous, septic, deadly. When his eyes found hers, something passed between them that transcended language, nationality, and war itself. Fear, raw, animal fear of death. And in that moment, before she even touched him, before the crisis that would unfold in the next hours, Margaret Brennan understood that this was not going to be just another day at the prison camp. This was going to be the day that defined what kind of doctor she was, what kind of person she was. 6 months earlier, Margaret had never imagined she would be standing in a prisoner of war camp in the Colorado Plains, treating the very men who served the regime that had plunged the world into chaos. She'd been 26 years old when she graduated from Boston University School of Medicine in 1942, one of only 17 women in a class of 134. The daughter of Irish immigrants, she had fought for every opportunity, every clinical rotation, every chance to prove that a woman could be just as capable a physician as any man. Her father, a Boston police sergeant, had been skeptical. Medicine was no place for a lady, he'd said. But her mother, a nurse who had served in the First World War, had quietly encouraged her. She'd seen what war did to men's bodies and souls, and she knew the world would need healers when this new war came. And come it did. Pearl Harbor happened during Margaret's second year of medical school. By the time she graduated, America was fully committed to a global conflict that would demand everything from everyone. Margaret had volunteered for military medical service immediately, driven by a sense of duty, but also by something deeper. A need to prove herself in a field dominated by men who still questioned whether a woman had the constitution, the emotional stability, the sheer strength to handle battlefield medicine. The Army had been hesitant. They needed doctors desperately, yes, but female physicians were viewed with suspicion, assigned to rear positions, given the cases that male doctors didn't want or didn't have time for. Which was exactly how she ended up at Camp Carson in the spring of 1944. The camp sprawled across the high desert plains south of Colorado Springs, a city of barracks and barbed wire that held nearly 9,000 German prisoners of war. Most had been captured in North Africa during the campaigns against Rommel's Afrika Korps, though some came from the Sicily and Italy invasions that followed. They were Nazis, the enemy. The men who had terrorized Europe, who had bombed Britain, who served a madman bent on conquering the world and exterminating entire populations. That's what Margaret told herself when she first arrived at the camp in March. That's what she needed to believe to steel herself for the work ahead. The newsreels had shown her the concentration camps being discovered across Europe, the skeletal prisoners, the mass graves. The systematic horror of the Holocaust was just beginning to come to light, though the full scope wouldn't be known until war's end. She'd seen the propaganda posters plastered across Boston, showing Germans as monsters, as inhuman beasts. She'd heard the stories from soldiers returning wounded from the European theater, tales of brutal combat and enemy ruthlessness. So when she stepped off the transport truck that first morning and saw the rows of German prisoners marching in formation across the compound, she expected to feel hatred, or at least a righteous anger. Instead, what she felt was confusion. These men looked tired, thin, young, disturbingly young. Many seemed barely old enough to shave, let alone to have committed the atrocities she'd been told about. The camp commandant, Colonel Robert Harrison, had been blunt during her orientation. The Geneva Convention required proper medical care for prisoners of war, he'd explained. 3 meals a day, adequate shelter, and treatment for illnesses and injuries. It wasn't charity. It was international law. America had signed the treaty, and unlike the Nazis, America would honor its commitments. But that didn't mean everyone was happy about it. Some of the guards resented the prisoners receiving care that their own brothers and sons couldn't get overseas. Some of the other doctors, the male physicians who'd been assigned to the camp, treated their duties with a kind of cold efficiency. Do the minimum. Keep them alive. Don't waste time or resources on men who'd been trying to kill Americans just months before. Margaret's first week had been a crash course in the strange reality of POW camps on American soil. The prisoners worked during the day, some in camp maintenance, others hired out to local farms and ranches facing labor shortages with so many American men overseas. They received wages, though the money went into camp accounts. They could write letters home, though all mail was censored. They had recreation time, even organized sports leagues and theater productions. It was all so bizarrely normal. And yet the barbed wire was real. The guard towers were real. The gulf between captor and captive was as wide as the ocean these men had crossed in the holds of Liberty ships. The medical station where Margaret worked was a converted barracks, partitioned into exam rooms in a small surgical area. Her duties ranged from treating routine illnesses to handling injuries from work details and the occasional fight between prisoners. The language barrier was enormous. Most prisoners spoke no English, and Margaret's German was limited to a few medical terms she'd memorized from a phrasebook. A handful of German-American soldiers served as translators, but they weren't always available. What surprised Margaret most in those early weeks was the politeness. The prisoners she treated were formal, almost courtly in their interactions with her. They stood when she entered a room. They said, "Danke," even when she knew the treatment she was providing was inadequate. They seemed shocked that a female doctor was treating them at all. She learned from the translators that many had never encountered a woman physician before, that in Germany the medical field was even more male-dominated than in America. But beneath that surface politeness, she sensed their fear. They were thousands of miles from home, in enemy territory, uncertain of their fates. Rumors spread through the camp constantly. Some prisoners believed they'd be executed once the war ended. Others thought they'd never see Germany again, that they'd be kept as permanent laborers. The propaganda they'd been fed by the Nazi regime told them Americans were barbaric, that captured German soldiers faced torture and death. Instead, they got 3 meals a day and medical care from a young woman doctor who was just as uncertain about how to relate to them as they were to her. 3 months into her assignment, Margaret had settled into an uneasy routine. She treated cases of pneumonia, set broken bones from work accidents, lanced infected blisters, and dispensed aspirin for headaches. She kept her interactions clinical, professional, distant. These were patients, not people. Numbers, not names. It was easier that way. Easier not to think about who they were, what they'd done, what they believed, until the morning of June 14th, 1944, when the stretcher bearers brought Klaus Hoffmann to her examination room, and everything changed. He'd been working on a farm detail near Pueblo when he collapsed. The guards thought it was heat exhaustion at first, common enough in the Colorado summer. But when they'd gotten his shirt off, they'd found the wound. A shrapnel injury to his left side, just below the ribs, that had been sutured weeks or months earlier. The sutures had held, barely, but beneath them the tissue had turned black. The infection had spread, tracking up toward his chest, down toward his abdomen. His temperature was 104 degrees. His pulse was rapid and thready. He was septic, his body fighting a war it was losing. The guards dumped him on the exam table and left. One muttered something about not understanding why they bothered. Let the Nazi die. Save the penicillin for someone who deserved it. Margaret stood over Klaus Hoffmann and made her assessment with the cold clarity her training had drilled into her. He needed immediate surgical debridement, the removal of all dead and infected tissue. He needed antibiotics, though supplies were limited even for American soldiers. He needed intravenous fluids to combat the dehydration from his fever. He needed intensive care. He needed, quite possibly, more than this camp medical station could provide. She should call for a transfer to the military hospital in Denver. Let the surgeons there make the call about how aggressive to be with treatment for an enemy POW. That would be the safe choice. The one that wouldn't raise questions. The one that wouldn't put her already precarious position as a female doctor under additional scrutiny. Instead, she called for Corporal Heinrich Waber, the translator, and told him to explain to the prisoner what she was about to do, that she was going to cut away the infected tissue, that it would hurt badly because they didn't have enough morphine to spare for adequate anesthesia, that he needed to hold still or he would die. Weber translated in rapid German. Klaus Hoffmann's fever-bright eyes found Margaret's face. He nodded once. He understood. She assembled her instruments, scalpel, forceps, iodine, bandages. Her hands moved automatically, years of training taking over. But her mind was racing. Why was she doing this? Why was she about to spend hours trying to save a man who might have killed American soldiers, who might have participated in atrocities, who wore the uniform of a regime built on hatred and genocide? Because he's a patient, a voice answered in her head. Because you took an oath. Because if you start deciding who deserves healing based on politics or nationality or which side of a war they're on, then you're no longer a doctor. You're something else entirely. Two of the male physicians passed by the examination room as she was preparing. Dr. Robert Walsh, a surgeon from Philadelphia, paused at the door. He was 53 years old enough to have served in the previous war, and he'd made his opinions about treating enemy prisoners crystal clear. "You're wasting your time, Brennan," he said flatly. "That infection's gone too far. Even if you cut away the dead tissue, sepsis has already set in. Give him some morphine to ease the pain and let nature take its course. We don't have the resources to throw at lost causes, especially not German ones." Margaret didn't look up from her instrument tray. The Geneva Convention requires we provide the same standard of care to prisoners that we'd provide to our own wounded. "The Geneva Convention is a piece of paper," Walsh shot back. "This is war. Resources are finite. Every drop of penicillin we use on him is a drop we can't use on an American soldier." "Then it's a good thing I'm not asking for your opinion or your penicillin," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "This is my patient and my call." Walsh shook his head and walked away. But Margaret knew he'd report this to the camp commandant. She was already under enough scrutiny as one of the few female doctors in military service. This would add to the questions about her judgment, her priorities, her fitness for the position. She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on Klaus Hoffmann. His breathing was shallow, his eyes were closed now, his body conserving every bit of energy for the fight against infection. She positioned the overhead lamp, adjusted the angle, and made the first incision. The smell intensified immediately as she opened the wound. Black necrotic tissue lay beneath the skin, spreading like ink through water. She began to cut, carefully removing each section of dead flesh, working her way deeper. Klaus's body tensed. Even in his fever state, the pain was immense. She saw his jaw clench, saw his hands grip the edges of the table. "Tell him to breathe," she instructed Weber. "Tell him I'm almost through the worst part." Weber spoke in German, his voice calm and steady. Klaus's eyes opened. He looked directly at Margaret, and then, as she made another deep cut, his hand shot out and grabbed hers. Not the one holding the scalpel, but her free hand that had been bracing against his abdomen. He grabbed it and wouldn't let go. Margaret's first instinct was to pull away. Her mind flashed to the warnings she'd received during orientation about prisoners becoming violent during medical procedures, about the need to maintain distance and control. But something in the way Klaus Hoffmann's fingers wrapped around hers stopped her. This wasn't aggression. This was desperation, the grip of a drowning man reaching for anything solid in a sea of pain. She looked down at their joined hands, his knuckles white with tension, then back at his face. Tears were streaming from the corners of his eyes, cutting tracks through the dirt and sweat on his temples. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin. But he wasn't fighting her. He was holding on as if her hand was the only thing keeping him tethered to consciousness, to life itself. "It's all right," she heard herself say softly, though she knew he couldn't understand the English words. "I've got you. You're going to be all right." She adjusted her position, compensating for the hand he held, and continued working with her other hand and the instruments. The wound was worse than she'd initially assessed. The shrapnel had entered just below his left rib cage, probably during combat in North Africa months ago. The field surgeon who'd treated him initially had done adequate work stitching the external wound, but had either missed or been unable to address the metal fragments still lodged deep in the tissue. Over weeks and months, those fragments had become focal points for infection. The body's attempt to wall off the foreign material had failed, and now the infection had spread through the muscle layers, tracking along fascial planes toward his vital organs. She could see streaks of red radiating outward from the wound site, blood poisoning, septicemia. In a fully equipped hospital with adequate staff and unlimited resources, Klaus Hoffmann would have a fighting chance. Here, in a prison camp medical station with limited antibiotics and no surgical team, his odds were far worse. But Margaret Brennan hadn't spent 4 years in medical school and 2 years of residency to give up on a patient because the odds were poor. She'd learned surgery from Dr. Eleanor Mitchell at Boston City Hospital, one of the few female surgeons in the country, a woman who'd taught her that being a female physician meant being twice as skilled and 3 times as determined as any male counterpart. Dr. Mitchell's voice echoed in her mind now. You don't choose patients based on whether they're easy cases. You choose to be a doctor, and that means treating everyone who comes through your door. Margaret worked methodically, cutting away each section of necrotic tissue. The wound extended deeper than she'd hoped. She had to remove muscle tissue that had turned gray and lifeless, had to excise infected fascia, had to probe for the shrapnel fragments that had caused all this damage. Each cut brought fresh blood, which was actually a good sign. It meant she was reaching tissue that was still alive, still perfused, still worth saving. Klaus's grip on her hand tightened with each incision. She could feel his pulse through his palm, racing, irregular. The fever and infection were putting enormous stress on his cardiovascular system. His body was fighting a war on multiple fronts, trying to heal while simultaneously being poisoned from within. Corporal Weber, Margaret said without looking up from her work, ask him where he was wounded. I need to know the timeline. Weber stepped closer, speaking in rapid German. Klaus's response came in gasps between waves of pain, his words broken and halting. He says Kasserine Pass, Weber translated. February of 1943, 16 months ago. The field hospital was overwhelmed. They stitched him up and sent him back to his unit within days. 16 months. Margaret's hands paused for just a moment. This wound had been festering on and off for 16 months. The human body's resilience was extraordinary. Klaus Hoffmann should have died from this infection a dozen times over. Somehow, through sheer luck or stubborn will, he'd survived battle after battle, capture, transport across the Atlantic, and months in the prison camp, all while carrying this ticking time bomb inside him. Tell him, Margaret said carefully, that I'm going to fix what they couldn't fix in North Africa. Tell him he needs to stay conscious for me. Can you do that? Weber translated. Klaus's response was barely a whisper, but Weber smiled slightly. He says he will try. He asks if you are an angel or a witch, because no woman doctor exists in his experience. Despite everything, despite the smell of infection and the gravity of the procedure, Margaret felt a brief flash of amusement. Tell him I'm just a doctor, same as any other, and tell him this next part is going to hurt worse than anything so far. She'd located the largest shrapnel fragment, a piece of metal about the size of her thumbnail, lodged against the posterior abdominal wall. It had to come out, but it was deep, surrounded by inflamed tissue, and dangerously close to major blood vessels. In a proper operating theater, she'd have assistants, retractors, better lighting, proper anesthesia. Here she had harsh overhead bulbs, basic instruments, and a patient who was conscious through necessity rather than choice. Margaret positioned her forceps, took a breath, and began to extract the fragment. Klaus's entire body went rigid. The hand holding hers clenched with such force, she felt the small bones in her fingers grind together. She heard him make a sound, a low animal groan that came from somewhere deep in his chest. But he didn't pull away. He didn't thrash. He held perfectly still, channeling all his agony into that single point of contact between them. The fragment came free. Blood welled up immediately, more than she'd hoped for, but less than she'd feared. She packed the wound with gauze, applied pressure, counted seconds. The bleeding slowed, no major vessel damage. The fragment clattered into a metal pan, and she allowed herself one small breath of relief. That was the worst of it, she told him, knowing Weber would translate. The rest is cleaning and closing. You're doing well. Better than most men I've treated. Through Weber, Klaus responded, his voice barely audible. My sister Anna, she's only 15. If I die here, who will tell her where? Who will tell her I thought of her?" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on the clinical aspects, the medical challenge, the procedure itself, that she'd managed to maintain her emotional distance. But this question, asked in extremis by a dying man worried not about himself, but about a 15-year-old girl half a world away, shattered something inside her carefully constructed walls. "You're not going to die," Margaret said firmly, looking directly into Klaus's eyes. "Do you understand me? I won't allow it. Your sister will see you again." Weber translated, and something changed in Klaus's expression. The fear didn't leave, but it was joined by something else. Hope, maybe, or trust. His grip on her hand shifted slightly, becoming less desperate and more deliberate, a connection rather than just a lifeline. Margaret returned to her work, irrigating the wound cavity with sterile, saline, removing every trace of infected tissue she could find. Her back ached from bending over the table. Sweat dripped down her temples despite the cool Colorado air. Her hand throbbed where Klaus held it, but she didn't try to pull away. Somehow, in this moment, that physical connection mattered more than comfort. It was communication beyond words, beyond nationality, beyond war. It was the fundamental human need to not face suffering alone. As she worked, Klaus began to speak again, this time unprompted. Weber translated in real time, his voice taking on the cadence of Klaus's German. "I grew up on a farm near Munich. Dairy cows mostly. My father wanted me to take over the farm, but I wanted to study engineering. There was a university in Munich that accepted me for 1939. Then Poland happened. Then France. Then they came to our village and took all the young men. They said it would be 6 months. They said we were liberating Europe from oppression. They said so many things." Margaret applied iodine to the cleaned wound, watching Klaus flinch, but continued talking as if the words themselves were a form of anesthesia. "In North Africa, we believed we were winning, even when we weren't. Even when the supply lines broke down and we had no water, even when the British tanks came and we had nothing to stop them. They told us to fight to the last man, to never surrender. That surrender was cowardice and betrayal." His voice caught, and fresh tears came. "I surrendered. When the Americans surrounded us at Tunis, I put my hands up. I chose life over the fatherland. My father would be ashamed. My commanding officer called us cowards as they marched us to the prison pens. But I wanted to see Anna again. I wanted to go home. Is that so wrong?" "No," Margaret said quietly, even though she knew he might not understand. "That's not wrong. That's human." She began suturing the wound in layers, working from deep to superficial, placing each stitch with precision. The worst was over. He would need antibiotics, fluids, close monitoring. But if infection didn't set in again, if his body could mount an immune response now that the source of contamination was removed, he would survive. 20 minutes had passed since Klaus had grabbed her hand, 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. And in that time, something fundamental had shifted in Margaret Brennan's understanding of who she was treating and why. She'd entered this room seeing a German soldier, a Wehrmacht private, a representative of the Nazi regime that had brought horror to the world. She was leaving it having treated Klaus Hoffmann, a farmer's son from Bavaria, who liked engineering and worried about his younger sister. A young man who had been drafted into a war he didn't start, who had fought because refusal meant death, and who had surrendered because he chose life. The propaganda hadn't prepared her for this. The newsreels showing jackbooted Nazis marching through conquered cities hadn't shown the frightened conscripts behind the cameras. The stories of German brutality, all true and documented, hadn't included the narratives of the teenage boys forced into uniforms and shipped to foreign deserts to fight for causes they barely understood. Margaret tied off the final suture and stepped back to examine her work. The wound was closed, packed with antibiotic-impregnated gauze, bandaged securely. Klaus's fever hadn't broken yet, but his vital signs had stabilized. His pulse was still rapid, but more regular. His breathing had eased now that the most acute pain had passed. Only then did Klaus release her hand. His fingers uncurled slowly, reluctantly, leaving pressure marks on her skin. He looked at his own hand as if surprised to find it had been holding hers this entire time, then looked at her with an expression of such profound gratitude that Margaret had to look away. "Danke," he whispered. "Danke, Frau Doktor." Weber didn't bother translating. Some things needed no translation. Margaret stripped off her surgical gloves, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She'd just spent 20 minutes in the most intimate form of combat, fighting death itself in the body of a man who'd been labeled her enemy. And somewhere in those 20 minutes, he'd stopped being a Nazi and become simply a patient, simply human. "Get him to a recovery bed," she instructed the orderlies who'd been waiting outside. "Intravenous fluids, as much as he'll take. I want vitals checked every 30 minutes. If his temperature spikes above 105, come get me immediately. And for God's sake, get him something for pain." As they wheeled Klaus away, he kept his eyes on Margaret until he disappeared through the doorway. She stood alone in the examination room, surrounded by the detritus of surgery, bloody gauze and soiled instruments, and the lingering smell of infection and iodine. Her hands were still shaking, not from the technical demands of the procedure, but from the emotional weight of what had just happened. In her medical training, professors had talked about maintaining professional distance, about not becoming emotionally involved with patients. But no one had told her how to maintain that distance when a dying man grabbed your hand and held on for 20 minutes while you cut into his flesh to save his life. No one had explained how to remain detached when that man whispered about his 15-year-old sister, and whether anyone would tell her where he died. Margaret walked to the sink and began scrubbing her hands, watching the water run red, then pink, then clear. She'd taken the Hippocratic Oath 3 years ago in a ceremony at Boston University, surrounded by her mostly male classmates, her voice joining theirs in the ancient promise, "I will apply dietetic measures for the benefit of the sick, according to my ability and judgment. I will keep them from harm and injustice. I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect." She'd meant every word then, but they'd been abstract words, theoretical commitments. Today, for the first time, she'd truly understood what they meant. They meant treating Klaus Hoffmann with the same care she'd give to any American soldier. They meant choosing healing over hatred. They meant recognizing that the humanity of the patient transcended the politics of the war. Dr. Walsh appeared in the doorway, his expression skeptical. "I heard you pulled it off, that the German's still breathing." "His name is Klaus Hoffmann," Margaret said quietly, drying her hands. "He's 22 years old. He's from Bavaria. And yes, he's still breathing." Walsh shook his head. "You know what they'll say, don't you? That you wasted time and resources, that you put a German ahead of American boys who might need that care." Margaret turned to face him fully. "I took an oath to heal the sick. It didn't include a nationality clause. And if that's a problem for anyone, they can take it up with the Geneva Convention, or better yet, with their own conscience." She walked past Walsh and out into the Colorado afternoon, where the sun was still high and hot, and the prison camp continued its strange routine of guards and prisoners, captors and captives, all living in the surreal temporary peace of a war that raged on other continents. But Margaret carried with her the memory of those 20 minutes, the weight of Klaus Hoffmann's hand in hers, the sound of his voice speaking of home and family, the moment when enemy became human, when soldier became patient, when the abstractions of war gave way to the concrete reality of one life saved. She didn't know it yet, but those 20 minutes would define the rest of her time at Camp Carson and shape how she practiced medicine for the remainder of her career. Because sometimes the most important lessons aren't learned in medical school or residency. Sometimes they're learned in makeshift hospital rooms, holding the hand of a dying enemy, choosing compassion over convenience, humanity over hatred. 20 minutes. That's all it had taken to change everything. The infection broke on the 3rd day. Margaret checked Klaus Hoffmann's temperature at 0600 hours and found it had dropped to 99.6 degrees, the first time it had been below 100 since the surgery. His wound showed healthy granulation tissue, pink and clean, with no signs of renewed infection. The antibiotics she'd fought to secure from the camp pharmacy had done their work. His body, young and resilient, despite months of poor nutrition and the stress of captivity, had rallied. But while Klaus Hoffmann's body was healing, Margaret Brennan's reputation at Camp Carson was undergoing a different kind of fever. Word of what she'd done, how long she'd spent on a single German prisoner, the resources she'd used, had spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. The criticism came first from predictable quarters. Dr. Walsh made his disapproval known at the weekly medical staff meeting, suggesting pointedly that some physicians seemed to have forgotten which side they were on. Two of the guards who'd transported Klaus to the medical station filed a complaint with the commandant, stating that Dr. Brennan had shown excessive concern for enemy personnel. Even some of the nurses, women who Margaret had thought might understand the ethical imperative of treating all patients equally, whispered in the mess hall about misplaced sympathies. Colonel Harrison called her to his office on the fourth day after the surgery. She stood at attention before his desk, still in her white coat, having been summoned directly from morning rounds. "Dr. Brennan," Harrison began, his weathered face unreadable, "I've received several complaints about your treatment of the German prisoner Klaus Hoffmann. The concerns range from resource allocation to the amount of time you spent on his case. I need to understand your reasoning." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Sir, the patient presented with life-threatening septicemia, secondary to retained shrapnel and inadequate initial treatment. The Geneva Convention requires us to provide prisoners of war with medical care, equivalent to what we'd provide our own troops. I did exactly that. Nothing more, nothing less." "For 20 minutes, Harrison said, "you held his hand during the procedure. That seems to go somewhat beyond medical necessity, Doctor." So that detail had made it into the reports. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice level. The patient was undergoing emergency surgery with inadequate anesthesia. He was in extreme pain and fear. The physical contact helped him remain still and conscious during the procedure. It was medically necessary, sir. Harrison studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "My wife is a nurse, Dr. Brennan. Served in France during the last war. She told me once that the difference between a good doctor and a great one is remembering that patients are people, not conditions. I think you remembered that." Dismissed. Margaret left his office with relief flooding through her, but she knew the criticism wouldn't end there. She was right. Over the following days, she felt the subtle ostracism from some of her colleagues, conversations that stopped when she entered the staff lounge, invitations to meals that didn't materialize, the unspoken accusation that she'd betrayed something, though no one could quite articulate what. But then, something unexpected happened. The German prisoners began to respond. It started with a request from a prisoner named Ernst Müller, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg who'd been captured in Italy. He'd developed pneumonia, and when the guards asked which doctor he wanted to see, he asked specifically for Die Frau Doktor, the woman doctor. Through Corporal Weber, Ernst explained that Klaus had told the other prisoners about her, about how she'd treated him with respect, even kindness, about how she'd worked for 20 minutes to save his life when other doctors had written him off. Margaret treated Ernst's pneumonia, prescribing sulfa drugs and rest, explaining through Weber the importance of keeping his fluid intake high. As she worked, Ernst talked about his life before the war. He'd taught history at a gymnasium in Hamburg, had a wife and 2 young daughters. He'd opposed the Nazis privately, voted against them in the last free election in 1933. But when the war came, refusal to serve meant imprisonment or execution. So he'd worn the uniform and carried a rifle and tried to survive. "I never fired my weapon," he told Margaret through translation. "Not once. I aimed high or I pretended my rifle jammed. I could not kill for Hitler's lies. But I could not refuse either, or my family would pay the price." The next case came 2 days later. A prisoner named Friedrich Koch had broken his arm in a work accident 3 months earlier. It had been set by one of the other camp doctors, but set poorly. Now the bone had healed at an angle, leaving Friedrich with limited use of his right hand. He was a carpenter, and the injury had devastated him. He requested Dr. Brennan specifically, hoping she could somehow fix what had gone wrong. Margaret examined the arm, felt the malunion in the bone, and knew the only real solution was to re-break it and set it properly. It would be painful, difficult, and there was no guarantee of success. She explained all this through Weber. Friedrich, a quiet man of 35 with calloused hands and sad eyes, simply nodded. "Better to try than to live half useful," he said. "You tried for Klaus when others would not. I trust you will try for me." The procedure took 2 hours. Margaret had to refracture the radius, align the bone properly, and immobilize it with a better cast than had been used initially. Friedrich bore the pain with stoic silence, occasionally gripping the edges of the examination table, but never crying out. Afterward, as she wrapped the final layer of plaster, he spoke in halting English he'd been practicing. "Thank you, Frau Doctor. You are a good person. War makes us forget good persons exist on both sides. You help us remember." The cases kept coming. A young prisoner, barely 18, named Hans Weber, no relation to the translator, had stopped eating. He'd lost 20 pounds in 6 weeks, was withdrawn, unresponsive, showing all the signs of severe depression. The camp psychiatrist, an army captain who handled mental health for both prisoners and staff, had seen Hans once and declared him a malingerer seeking attention. But when Hans collapsed during a work detail and was brought to the medical station, Margaret saw something different. She sat with Hans for 3 hours one afternoon, with Corporal Weber translating. Slowly, through patience and gentle questioning, the story emerged. Hans had been conscripted on his 18th birthday in 1943. He'd received 6 weeks of training before being shipped to Italy. His entire unit had been captured during the Allied invasion, and he'd been in American custody ever since. He'd never fired a shot in combat, never killed anyone. But the nightmares still came. Nightmares of what he'd seen, what he'd been ordered to prepare to do, what the other soldiers in his training unit had bragged they'd done in Poland and Russia. "I close my eyes and I see terrible things," Hans whispered. "Things men told me about, things I was supposed to do. I cannot eat because my stomach knows I wore the uniform of monsters. Even though I never hurt anyone, I wore the uniform. How do I live with that?" Margaret had no easy answers, but she arranged for Hans to see the camp psychiatrist again, this time insisting on being present to advocate for proper treatment. She made sure he received additional food rations, monitored his weight weekly, and simply talked with him during his checkups. Not about the war, but about ordinary things. What he wanted to do after repatriation, whether he liked to read, what his family's farm in Saxony had grown. Slowly, incrementally, Hans began to eat again. The weight came back. The light returned to his eyes. He started attending the camp's education classes, learning English, studying American history. He told Margaret through Weber that she'd given him something he'd lost. The belief that not everyone saw him as a monster, that redemption might be possible. Through these cases and dozens of others, Margaret began to understand the complex reality that official propaganda on both sides had obscured. The German prisoners at Camp Carson were not a monolithic mass of Nazi fanatics. They were individuals, each with their own stories, their own reasons for being in uniform, their own degrees of complicity or resistance, or simply survival. Some, it was true, remained ideologically committed to the Nazi cause. They gave stiff-armed salutes when they thought guards weren't watching. They intimidated other prisoners who spoke positively about America. They were the true believers, the ones who would return to Germany still convinced of Aryan supremacy and the righteousness of Hitler's vision. But they were a minority. Most of the prisoners Margaret treated were like Klaus and Ernst and Friedrich. Men who'd been caught in history's machinery, who'd made compromises to protect themselves and their families, who'd worn the uniform without embracing the ideology. They were learning, through their captivity in America, that the propaganda they'd been fed was lies. The food shocked them most profoundly. After years of rationing in Germany, of ersatz coffee and sawdust bread, they couldn't believe the abundance in the camp mess halls. 3 full meals daily, real coffee, meat several times a week, vegetables, and fruit. Some prisoners gained 20 or 30 pounds in their first months of captivity, their bodies recovering from chronic malnutrition they hadn't even realized they'd been suffering. One prisoner told Margaret through Weber that he'd written home describing the food, but his letter had been returned by German censors with a note accusing him of spreading false propaganda. No one in Germany would believe that prisoners of war in America ate better than free citizens in the Reich. The work assignments surprised them too. Rather than brutal labor camps, they found themselves working on farms and ranches, paid small wages, treated by most employers with rough fairness. They were building roads, harvesting crops, keeping America's domestic economy running, while American men fought overseas. It was still captivity, still controlled, but it bore no resemblance to the torture and starvation they'd been told awaited captured German soldiers, and the legal protections astonished them. When a guard at Camp Carson struck a prisoner during a dispute over work assignments, the guard was court-martialed and removed from duty. The prisoner received an official apology. In a country at total war with Germany, justice still mattered, rules still applied. The Geneva Convention wasn't just paper. It was enforced. Margaret learned these details through her patients, through the conversations that happened during examinations and treatments. She learned that German propaganda had painted America as a nation of gangsters and robber barons, a democracy so weak and decadent it would collapse at the first real test. Instead, the prisoners found a nation so strong it could afford to treat its enemies humanely, so confident in its values that it didn't need to brutalize captives to prove its superiority. The statistics supported this reality. Of the approximately 375,000 German prisoners held in the United States during World War II, fewer than 1% died in captivity. Most of those deaths were from illness or accident, not mistreatment. By contrast, German POW camps in Eastern Europe saw death rates of 40% or higher, depending on the theater and time period. American camps weren't comfortable, but they were survivable. That distinction mattered enormously. Margaret also learned about the challenges facing female physicians in military service. She was one of fewer than 100 women doctors serving in the Army Medical Corps during the war. Women physicians were restricted from combat zones, limited to stateside assignments, paid less than their male counterparts with equivalent training. Many faced hostility from male colleagues who viewed their presence as a wartime anomaly that would and should end when peace came. The work with POWs was considered particularly inappropriate for female doctors. The prevailing attitude was that women lacked the emotional fortitude to remain objective when treating enemy soldiers, that they'd either be too sympathetic or too fearful. Margaret's success in treating Klaus and the subsequent requests for her care from other prisoners challenged those assumptions. But challenging assumptions didn't make her popular with those who held them. Still, she persisted, because every prisoner she treated reinforced the lesson she'd learned during those 20 minutes holding Klaus Hoffmann's hand. These were human beings. They'd made choices, some terrible, within circumstances that were often beyond their control. Healing them didn't mean condoning what Germany had done. It meant honoring the oath she'd taken and the values America claimed to represent. Klaus's recovery became a symbol of that philosophy. By the end of June, he was back on light work duty, his wound fully closed and healing well. He began appearing at the medical station not as a patient, but as a visitor, usually in the early evening when Margaret was finishing her rounds. He never came empty-handed. The first gift was a carved wooden bird, a sparrow rendered in intricate detail from a scrap of lumber he'd been allowed to keep from a work detail. He left it on her desk without a word, but Margaret found it there one evening, so lifelike she expected it to take flight. She asked Weber about it the next day, and the translator smiled. Klaus works in the camp carpentry shop now. He says carving helps him think. He says he wanted to make something beautiful for the person who gave him back his life. More carvings followed. A horse mid-gallop, a farmhouse that looked like it might have been his family's home in Bavaria, a pair of hands clasped in prayer or perhaps just holding on. Each piece was left anonymously, but Margaret knew who they were from. She kept them all on a shelf in her quarters, small reminders that healing worked in both directions. Then came the letter. It arrived at the medical station in early July, written in careful, labored English on lined paper from the camp school. "Dear Dr. Brennan," it began, "my English is not good, but I try. You saved my life in June. I was dying, and you fix me. The other doctors say let him die, but you say no. You hold my hand for 20 minutes. I never forget this. In Germany, they tell us Americans are bad people. They lie. You are good people. You are a good person. When I go home to Bavaria, I will tell everyone about you. I will tell them that one American doctor showed me that kindness is stronger than war. Thank you for my life. Klaus Hoffmann. Margaret read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in her locker. She couldn't keep it on display, not with the ongoing criticism of her treatment decisions. But she couldn't discard it either. It represented something too important, evidence that healing wasn't just physical, that the work of medicine extended beyond closing wounds and curing infections, that sometimes saving one life could change a dozen hearts. Klaus began, asking questions during his visits. Through Weber, he wanted to know about America. What was it really like? Why had America entered the war? Did Americans really hate all Germans or just Nazis? What would happen when the war ended? Would the prisoners be punished? Would they be allowed to go home? Margaret answered as honestly as she could. She told him about growing up in Boston, about her Irish immigrant parents, about a country built by people fleeing oppression and poverty. She explained that America hadn't wanted this war, but couldn't stand by while tyranny consumed Europe. She admitted that yes, many Americans were angry at Germany, but that anger was directed at the Nazi regime and its crimes, not at individual Germans who'd been swept along by history. "What will you do?" Klaus asked one evening. "After the war, will you stay in the army?" Margaret considered the question. She'd been so focused on the immediate demands of each day that she hadn't thought much about the future. "I think I'll go back to civilian practice, open a clinic maybe, somewhere that needs doctors. You?" "I will go home," Klaus said simply. "I will find my sister Anna. I will rebuild my father's farm. And I will remember that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose kindness. People like you." As summer deepened into August, the dynamic at Camp Carson continued to shift. The German prisoners who'd been treated by Dr. Brennan spoke about her with something approaching reverence. They called her Die Gut Doctor, the good doctor. They told new arrivals from other camps that if you were sick or injured, you wanted to see the woman physician with the steady hands and the patient eyes, the one who'd spent 20 minutes holding a dying man's hand and wouldn't let death win. And slowly, even some of Margaret's critics among the American staff began to soften. They saw that her compassionate treatment didn't make the prisoners dangerous or defiant. If anything, it made them more cooperative, more willing to work, more open to the possibility that Germany's cause had been wrong and America's war aims might be just. The ripple effects of those 20 minutes in June continued to spread outward, touching lives in ways Margaret couldn't fully comprehend. She'd made a choice, in a moment of crisis, to see the human being before seeing the enemy. And that choice had changed everything, not just for Klaus Hoffmann, but for dozens of prisoners and staff members who'd witnessed or heard about what happened. Sometimes the most powerful victories aren't won with weapons. They're won with compassion, one patient at a time, one act of healing at a time, until the very notion of enemy becomes harder to sustain in the face of shared humanity. The news reached Camp Carson on May 8, 1945, crackling through radio speakers and spreading through the compound like wind across the Colorado plains. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. After nearly 6 years of global conflict, after millions of deaths and the devastation of an entire continent, the Third Reich had finally collapsed. Margaret Brennan heard the announcement while treating a prisoner with a sprained ankle. The man, a former baker from Cologne named Werner, had been listening to the Armed Forces radio broadcast along with her. When the official announcement came, when President Truman's voice declared the unconditional surrender, Werner's face crumpled. He began to weep, not from joy, but from a complex mixture of relief and grief that Margaret was beginning to understand characterized the German prisoners' response to their homeland's defeat. Throughout the camp, the reaction among the 9,000 German POWs was muted, complicated. Some felt genuine relief that the killing had stopped, that they might eventually see their families again. Others felt shame at their nation's defeat, a sense of betrayal even though many had come to understand that Germany's cause had been unjust. Still others felt nothing but dread, knowing they would return to a Germany that existed now only as rubble and ruin, occupied by foreign armies, stripped of its sovereignty. The American personnel celebrated openly. Parties erupted in the staff quarters. Soldiers who'd been stationed at Camp Carson for years, who'd missed the fighting overseas, finally had something concrete to celebrate. The enemy was defeated. The boys would be coming home. A world at peace seemed possible again. But in the medical station, where Margaret continued her rounds, the mood was somber. The prisoners who came to see her that day and in the days that followed wanted to talk about what came next. Would they be sent home immediately? Would there be trials, punishments? Would they find their families alive, their homes standing, their villages still existing? Margaret had no answers. No one did. The machinery of repatriation would take months to organize. Germany was divided into occupation zones. The infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of displaced persons clogged the roads and railways. The prisoners at Camp Carson would have to wait, living in limbo between war and whatever came after. Klaus Hoffmann found Margaret 2 days after the surrender announcement. She was in her office, reviewing medical files, when he knocked softly on the doorframe. He'd learned enough English over the past 11 months to speak haltingly without a translator, though Corporal Weber still helped with complex conversations. "Dr. Brennan," Klaus said carefully, "may I speak with you?" She gestured to the chair across from her desk. Klaus sat, his hands folded in his lap, his posture formal. He'd filled out since his near-death experience the previous June. The good food and steady work had restored the health that war and infection had stolen. He looked like what he was, a healthy 23-year-old man with his whole life ahead of him, but his eyes carried the weight of everything he'd seen and survived. "I hear we go home soon," Klaus began. "Maybe 2 months, maybe 3. They say we go to camps in Germany first, then they decide who goes to which zone. Then maybe I find my family." Margaret nodded. She'd heard the same rumors from the camp administration. "Are you ready to go back?" Klaus was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know what I go back to. I had letters from my sister Anna, 6 letters in 18 months. The last one was January. She says the farm is gone, bombed. She's in Munich with our aunt. She's alive, but Germany is dead." "Germany isn't dead," Margaret said softly. "It's wounded. But wounded things can heal. You know that better than anyone." Klaus touched his side reflexively, where the scar from Margaret's surgery marked him permanently. "You saved my life," he said. "Not just my body, my soul also. I was taught that Americans are evil, that you have no honor, no culture, only money and machines. But you showed me this is a lie. You held my hand when I was dying. You treated me like a human being when I was your enemy. This changed everything for me." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "I was just doing my job, Klaus. What any doctor should do." "No," Klaus said firmly, his English becoming more confident as emotion drove him. "Other doctors, they say let him die. They say he is just a German. But you say no. You fight for my life like I am your brother. This is not just a job. This is humanity. This is what Germany forgot, what the Nazis destroyed. The idea that every person has worth, that even an enemy deserves compassion." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. "I write this in English. I practice many times. I want to read it to you." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Klaus unfolded the paper and began to read, his accent thick but his words clear. "Dear Dr. Brennan, when I came to your hospital room in June 1944, I thought I would die. I was ready to die. I had seen too much death, caused too much pain by being part of the Wehrmacht, even if I never wanted to fight. I thought death was what I deserved. But you said no. You said every life has value. You spent 20 minutes holding my hand while you cut away the infection that was killing me. 20 minutes that changed my whole life, because in those 20 minutes, I learned that hate is not stronger than love, that war is not stronger than compassion, that even in the darkest time in human history, there are people who choose to heal instead of hurt. You saved more than my body that day. You saved my faith in humanity. You showed me that the future can be different from the past. When I go back to Germany, I will carry this lesson with me. I will rebuild my family's farm. I will help rebuild my country, and I will tell everyone about the American doctor who treated a dying enemy like a human being. Thank you for my life. Thank you for showing me a better way. I will never forget. Klaus Hoffmann." When he finished reading, Tears were streaming down his face. Margaret found she was crying too, the professional distance she'd tried to maintain finally crumbling completely. This was why she'd become a doctor. Not for moments like this exactly, but for the fundamental belief that healing mattered, that every life saved was a victory against entropy and death. "I'll never forget you either," Margaret said quietly. "You taught me something too, that my oath to heal isn't just about medicine. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, even when everything in the world tells me not to, especially then." Klaus carefully folded the letter and placed it on her desk. "For you to keep. So you remember that what you did mattered, that it changed one German soldier's whole life. Maybe that seems small when millions died in this war, but it is not small to me. It is everything." They sat in silence for a moment, two people from opposite sides of history's greatest conflict, connected by 20 minutes of shared humanity in the midst of inhumanity. "Will you write?" Margaret asked. "Let me know you made it home safely, that you found Anna." "I will try," Klaus promised. "But Germany is chaos now. Mail does not work, roads are broken, everything is confusion. But if I can, I will write. I will tell you about rebuilding the farm, about finding my sister, about what happens next." "I hope you find peace, Klaus," Margaret said. "I hope you get to live the life that war tried to take from you." "I hope you do also, Dr. Brennan. You deserve happiness. You deserve to know that your kindness made waves that will spread farther than you can see." When Klaus left her office that day, Margaret sat for a long time staring at the letter he'd left on her desk. She knew the odds of hearing from him again were slim. The chaos of post-war Europe would swallow millions of stories, including this one. But she also knew that she'd been part of something important, something that transcended the immediate medical care she'd provided. She'd proven that even in war, even when treating the enemy, it was possible to remain human. The repatriation process began in July of 1945 and continued through early 1946. Margaret watched as groups of prisoners were loaded onto trains bound for ports on the East Coast, where ships would carry them back across the Atlantic to a Germany they barely recognized. Klaus was in one of the last groups to leave, in January of 1946. He found Margaret at the medical station the morning of his departure, shook her hand formally, and said simply, "Thank you for everything. I will not forget." Then he was gone, one more German soldier disappearing into the machinery of history. Margaret mustered out of the Army Medical Corps in March of 1946. She returned to Boston, to civilian life, to the challenge of building a medical practice in a world that still questioned whether women should be doctors at all. She faced the same discrimination she'd encountered before the war, the assumption that female physicians were inherently less capable, less serious, less committed than their male counterparts. But she also brought with her the confidence of someone who'd proven herself under the worst conditions imaginable. She'd saved lives in a prison camp with limited resources and constant criticism. She'd made ethical choices that had been vindicated not just medically, but morally. She'd held the hand of a dying enemy and refused to let hatred win. She opened a small practice in a working-class neighborhood in South Boston, treating Irish and Italian immigrants, longshoremen, and factory workers, people who couldn't afford the fancy doctors in the wealthy parts of the city. She married in 1948 a lawyer named Thomas Brennan, distant cousin from the same extended Irish clan. They had 3 children. She balanced motherhood and medicine in an era when women were told they couldn't do both. She proved again that she could. But she never forgot Camp Carson, never forgot the German prisoners she'd treated, never forgot Klaus Hoffmann in those 20 minutes that had defined everything that came after. She kept his letter in her desk drawer at home, taking it out occasionally to reread when the challenges of being a female physician in mid-century America felt overwhelming. The letter reminded her why she'd chosen this path, why healing mattered, why compassion, even toward enemies, was the only antidote to the poison of hatred. Klaus Hoffmann did make it back to Bavaria. He found his sister Anna alive but traumatized, living in a displaced persons camp near Munich. The family farm was rubble, bombed by Allied aircraft in the final months of the war. His father had died in an air raid. His mother had succumbed to pneumonia in the harsh winter of 1944 to 45. But Klaus was 24 years old, strong, determined, and carrying with him the lesson he'd learned from an American doctor in Colorado. That rebuilding was possible, that life was worth fighting for, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. He used his carpentry skills, learned in the prison camp workshop, to begin rebuilding. First, a small house for himself and Anna, then helping neighbors rebuild their homes. Gradually, the farm took shape again. New buildings, new livestock, new crops. By 1950, Klaus Hoffmann was farming successfully again, married to a local woman named Greta, who'd also survived the war, starting a family of his own. But he also became involved in local politics, specifically in efforts to build bridges between Germany and America. He joined organizations promoting democratic values, opposing the remnants of Nazi ideology that still lingered in some corners of German society. He spoke at schools about his experiences as a POW, about the treatment he'd received in America, about the doctor who'd saved his life and his faith in humanity. He never forgot his promise to tell people about Margaret Brennan. He told everyone who would listen about the American doctor who'd held his hand for 20 minutes and refused to see him as an enemy. That story became part of his mission, part of his argument that reconciliation was possible, that former enemies could become friends. The years passed. Klaus's farm prospered, his children grew, Germany rebuilt, slowly transforming from ruins into a democracy, a prosperous nation integrated into Western Europe. Margaret's practice thrived, her children grew. America moved through the 50s and into the 60s, changing in ways both promising and troubling. They'd lost touch completely. Despite Klaus's promise to write, the chaos of post-war Europe had made it impossible. Margaret had moved from her first apartment. Klaus had no way to reach her. The letter he'd written in 1947, painstakingly composed in improving English, had been returned as undeliverable. After that, he'd assumed she'd moved on, forgotten about the German prisoners she'd treated during the war. He was wrong. In 1967, Klaus Hoffmann traveled to America as part of a German-American friendship delegation. He was 45 years old now, successful, respected, a local politician and farmer who'd become an advocate for reconciliation between former enemies. The delegation was visiting several American cities, including Boston, to strengthen cultural and economic ties. Before the trip, Klaus hired a private investigator to locate Dr. Margaret Brennan. It took 3 months and considerable expense, but eventually the investigator found her. She was still practicing medicine in South Boston, still Dr. Margaret Brennan professionally, despite her married name, still treating the poor and working class, still, at 50 years old, proving that female physicians could have long, successful careers. Klaus arranged to visit her practice on an October afternoon, unannounced. He wanted to surprise her, to thank her in person after 23 years. He walked into her waiting room, now middle-aged and prosperous-looking in a well-tailored suit, carrying a small wooden box. The receptionist asked if he had an appointment. In English far more fluent than his halting words of 1946, Klaus said, "Please tell Dr. Brennan that Klaus Hoffmann from Camp Carson is here to see her. She will know who I am." 5 minutes later, Margaret Brennan emerged from her office, her face showing shock and recognition and joy all at once. She was older, her dark hair now streaked with gray, her face lined with the years of hard work and motherhood and the constant challenge of being a female physician in a male-dominated field. But her eyes were the same, compassionate, intelligent, kind. "Klaus," she said in disbelief, "is it really you?" "It is really me, Dr. Brennan. I came to thank you. 23 years late, but I came." They talked for 2 hours in her office while her staff handled the afternoon appointments. Klaus told her everything about finding Anna, about rebuilding the farm, about his work promoting democracy and German-American friendship, about how the lesson he'd learned from her, that compassion was stronger than hatred, had shaped his entire adult life. He opened the wooden box he'd brought and showed her what was inside. Photographs of his farm, rebuilt and thriving. Pictures of his wife and 3 children, news clippings about his political work, and a carved wooden figure, larger and more intricate than anything he'd made in the prison camp. It showed 2 hands clasped together, one marked with the letters USA, and the other with Deutschland. holding on, just as they'd held on during those 20 minutes in June of 1944. "You saved my life," Klaus said, "but more than that, you showed me that even in the darkest moment in human history, individuals can choose compassion over hatred. That choice changed everything for me. I've spent 23 years trying to honor that lesson, trying to build instead of destroy, trying to heal instead of hurt, just as you did." Margaret took the carved hands, tears in her eyes. "I've thought about you so many times over the years," she admitted. "Wondered if you made it home, if you found your sister, if you got to live the life you deserved. I'm so glad you did. So grateful you came to tell me." "What you did matters, Dr. Brennan," Klaus said earnestly. "Not just to me, but to everyone I've told the story to. Thousands of people have heard about the American doctor who treated an enemy soldier with compassion, who spent 20 minutes holding his hand during surgery, who refused to let hatred win. That story has changed minds, has softened hearts, has shown people that reconciliation is possible. You planted a seed that day. I've been helping it grow ever since." Margaret understood then something she'd only glimpsed during the war. That healing wasn't just about the immediate patient. It rippled outward, touching lives in ways impossible to measure. Klaus had taken the compassion she'd shown him and multiplied it across decades, across thousands of interactions, across an entire life dedicated to building bridges between former enemies. In a later interview, when Margaret was asked about her experiences treating German POWs during World War II, she reflected on those 20 minutes with Klaus Hoffmann. "I learned that healing isn't just medical," she said. "It's moral. The opposite of war isn't peace. It's the choice to see humanity in your enemy. To recognize that even in the midst of conflict, even when everything tells us to hate, we can choose compassion instead. Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance against hatred is simple, uncomplicated compassion. Holding someone's hand when they're dying, treating them with dignity when the world tells you they don't deserve it. Those small acts matter more than we can possibly know." Klaus Hoffmann passed away in 1993 at 71 years old, surrounded by his children and grandchildren on the Bavarian farm he'd rebuilt from rubble. His obituary mentioned his work promoting German-American friendship, his decades of public service, and his experience as a prisoner of war in America, where, as he often told people, an American doctor saved not just his life, but his faith in humanity. Margaret Brennan practiced medicine until she was 73 years old, finally retiring in 1990. She'd treated thousands of patients over 5 decades, delivered hundreds of babies, saved countless lives. But when people asked her about her most important case, she always talked about a June day in 1944 when she spent 20 minutes holding the hand of a dying German soldier named Klaus Hoffmann. "That was the day I truly became a doctor," she would say, "because I learned that healing transcends politics, nationality, and war. That our highest calling is to recognize the humanity in everyone, especially when it's hardest to see. Klaus taught me that just as much as I taught him anything. We saved each other in different ways. He reminded me why I became a doctor. I reminded him why life was worth living." The carved wooden hands Klaus had given her sat on her desk for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder that 20 minutes can change everything, that the choice to extend compassion to an enemy can ripple across decades, across continents, across generations, that in the end, the victories that matter most aren't won on battlefields. They're won in moments of human connection, when we choose to see each other as we truly are. Not enemies, not others. Simply human beings doing our best to survive in a world that too often teaches us to hate. 20 minutes, 2 hands clasped together, 1 German soldier and 1 American doctor. A moment that proved compassion is stronger than war, that healing is more powerful than hatred, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness cast the longest shadows into the future.